Okay, this video covers in part Dr. Gerald Stevens' Intro to Greek Grammar textbook, chapter 11. Now, I say in part, which by the way is entitled Adverbs and More. Now, I say this video covers in part chapter 11 because chapter 11 is so long and has so many different things that Stevens introduces that I thought it better to kind of break it up to help you kind of understand the chapter in smaller chunks. So what I'm going to do is actually make a couple of different, probably two or three different videos covering the various parts of chapter 11 because it can be confusing because you get up to this point. Most of the chapters have been very logical in the sense of you learn for example, you learn the alphabet, and then you learn accents, and then you learned the sort of workhorse of the Greek tense language. You learn verbs in their present, active, and then middle passive sense. Then you learn nouns, all three declensions. You learn adjectives and articles as a part of nouns because they use the same declension pattern as the nouns, those three declension patterns. So it's been very logical up to this point, and each chapter is like a self-contained unit and makes some sense. This one can be confusing because what Stevens has done at this point in your learning of the Greek language is he says, okay, we've got to get to this part of speech called the adverb. And this is when you're dealing with adverbs, you're dealing with a very versatile aspect of language, and you're also dealing with comparative ideas, things like that. It's a nice place to lump in a lot of these sort of various, I hate to say unrelated, but these various aspects of the language. You got to get somewhere, so he just kind of throws them together here because they're loosely related in terms of comparative ideas and numbers. So you're going to get in this chapter adverbs. You're going to get comparative ways to do comparison, and there's several different ways like adjective, comparative constructions. Then you're going to get numbers, and you go, what does that have to do with anything? Well, they're loosely related to adjectives and adverbs. And then you're going to get, at the end of the chapter, how to do conjunction. He's going to introduce you to conjunction. So you're going to get adverbs, comparative options. How do you make comparatives? This is better than that, things like that. You're going to get numbers, the whole number system in this chapter. And you're going to get introduced, Stevens introduces you to how clause connectors, conjunctions. And so there's four major aspects of the language, of Greek language or any language, that Stephen introduces, kind of just throws them all together. It's like a catch-all kind of chapter. So again, easier for me to break some of this up, or else we would have one really long video, and I just thought it would be easier to work your way through. So in this first video on chapter 11, I'm going to cover the subject of adverbs, which he covers on page 153. And it goes to the top of construction for comparisons. Well, I'll probably do that and comparisons. 153 to the top of page 157. Then he gets into numbers on the bottom of page 157. So I'll cover adverbs and comparisons. And to save myself a little bit of time, I wrote a few things on the board here. So So first of all, what are adverbs? Adverbs, when we think about them in the English language, we normally think of adverbs as as words that modify verbs. And for the most part, that's what they do. They modify verbs. If I were to give you a verb and I would say he ran, I could modify that word ran with an adverb telling you, answering to some degree, how, when, or where he ran. And so you'll notice on the top of page 153, Stevens tell you what adverbs basically do. Basically, they're going to do more than this, but basically what they do is they, most of the time, modify verbs, and they answer the question of time, place, or manner. So if I were to say, he ran the race, and you were to say, how did he run the race? Well, he ran the race slowly, quickly. He ran quickly, something like that, or he ran slowly. You notice we're adding some adverbs there in order to modify the verb, and in those two cases telling you how he ran, quickly or slowly. It can tell you, we can also add verbs, add adverbs to tell you sort of when or where, and when. And we do this in English with some with prepositions, like he ran after the race. And if I wanted to say something like that, he didn't run in the race. He went out and ran on the track after the race. And so sometimes we can use prepositional phrases to kind of modify verbs, and we do that in English. But in Greek, adverbs can tell you something about the when, the where, or the how of the action. Now, that's how we normally think of adverbs. But as he says on page 153, adverbs can also function in other ways. I mean, they can just about do anything. They can modify nouns like an adjective, and he gives you some examples here. The man outside the house is my father. In that phrase, the adverb is acting like a preposition in a sense. The man who is outside. The word outside is the adverb, and it's modifying man, which is the noun. Now, I can take that same adverb outside and I can modify a verb with it, as adverbs normally do. I could say, he ran, and you could say, where did he run? And I would say, he ran outside. Notice, in that sense, he ran outside. Outside is modifying the verb, ran. He ran, and it tells me where he ran, not how he ran. Quickly would tell me how he ran. Notice I can pile up adverbs on a verb. He ran outside quickly. He ran quickly outside. And then in that case, I've got two adverbs modifying the verb, telling me where and how he ran. And so in this case, the man outside the house, outside is modifying the noun, and it's an adverb functioning like an adjective. He also says sometimes adverbs can function like substantives as the object of a preposition. He gives you an example there from the present, something like that. Here's the good news, and that's a little bit more rare. You're going to run into that kind of thing, but it's a little bit more rare. Now, here's the good news about adverbs. They're not inflected, so no new ending patterns or anything like that. You're going to say, well, how do I know what an adverb is? There are two basic ways. One, the main way is vocabulary. You just kind of learn them by vocabulary. Now, if you think about it, even in English, it works this way. If you were teaching somebody English and they said, well, how do I know what adverbs are in English? You'd say, well, you just kind of, you learn them mostly by vocabulary. Now, there is a second little trick, which we kind of have in English too, something similar, and that is that, as he says there in 153, adverbs generally, not always, but generally will end with an omega sigma. So they generally end with that. So this is a unique ending, this omega sigma. You think about it. You haven't seen any of your declensions. It's not any of your present active or middle passive endings. This omega sigma is a unique kind of ending. So what will happen is, as you're translating Greek and learning the vocabulary, over time, you'll get to learning these words that have the omega sigma at the end, and you'll just kind of, your eye will spot them and know, oh, those are adverbs. They kind of stick out like a sore thumb. And he's got a few of them listed here on page 153. I've just written them down. Now notice, some of them you learn by vocabulary. By the way, in English we have this, right? If I put an ly at the end of a verb, it really carries that idea. He ran quickly. Quick is an adverb. I could say he is quick. In that sense, that adverb is functioning like a predicate adjective, isn't it? He ran, or he is quick. He is quick. Just functioning like an adjective. If I say he ran quickly, in English we add that ly. And we would tell somebody learning English, well, when you see that ly on the end, that's a little tip off that this is an adverb. In the same way, the omega sigma is kind of a tip off. I've got an adverb here, but not always. Noon is a very, very common one. You're going to see all over the place in the Greek, and it means now. You just learn it as a vocabulary word. Some of them, a lot more of them, like hios, until, and hutos, which is thus or in this way. By the way, we've been learning John 3:16 as a class, and John 3:16, if I remember right, you have this at the beginning. In this way, if I remember now, I feel like I should check myself just to make sure that I put it on the video. But anyway, so these are a couple of examples of adverbs, and you notice a couple of them end with that telltale sign of the omega sigma, and noon doesn't. Yeah. John 3:16 starts with hutos gar, and now you see it's an adverb. It's functioning. There in this way, or in this way, God so loved the world, something like that. So that's adverbs. So you learn them by vocabulary, And that's basically it. And sometimes recognizing this as a telltale sign you've got an adverb, and just knowing how you just know that it could be modifying a noun, it could be modifying a verb, it could be doing several different things. Though most of the time it modifies verbs. On page 154, let's talk about comparisons. Over the next 3 pages, he's going to basically introduce you to how do you do comparisons in the Greek language. Well, there are actually several different ways, just like there are in English. One of the ways he's going to show you on page 154 is by adjective comparisons or degrees of comparisons. Now, there are 2 kinds of ways to do adjective comparisons. One way is to do them, and you see this in number 2, Greek formation. One of them is to do them in a regular way, and one of them is in an irregular way. And so one of the regular ways that they do this is through adding this performative kind of, it's not the best word for it. They add, what's the language he uses? A degree of comparison. They actually change the spelling. I'm searching for the word all of a sudden. But take a word like neos, and this is in your chart on table 11.1 on page 154. Take the word neos, which means new. If I just have that in a sentence, I translate it new. You learn it like an adjective. I mean, you learn it like a vocabulary. But if I wanted to say something is newer or something is the newest out of a group, that's a comparison idea. I'm comparing one thing to another. It's that item is newer than that item, or that item is newest amongst all the items, plural. There's a bunch more than just 2. Then one of the regular ways I can do that in Greek is by adding this little, you might say a suffix. He doesn't give a name for it, but anyway, it's you actually change the wording, you change the way the word is spelled, and you add this little piece in here, kind of like we do when we say newer. We say newer, we're adding the er, and we say newest, we're adding that suffix in order to show comparison. Well, in Greek it does the same way, and what you just have to learn is that this is the suffix, ter and tot. So anytime I add that word ter at the end of it really is a suffix now that I think about it, at the end of the word, then what I'm getting is a comparative idea. So new, newer, newest. Now, because these are adjectives, you add these 2 adjectives. Remember, adjectives, unlike adverbs, are inflected. We learned that from the adjective chapter. And so it's going to have the ending. If you're saying, why does it come in the middle? Better word, I just realized, better word for this is a suffix. If you say, why does that ter, which means it's our equivalent of er, like newer in English, in tot, it's like our equivalent of est, newest in English. If you say, why does it come in the middle of the word? It's really not. It's coming at the end of the stem before the ending. This is an adjective, and it's going to have one of those. Remember, adjectives are going to follow those first, second. They're going to have those first, second, third declension endings. And so, depending on the adjective. So, here's your ending, and it's coming between the stem and the ending. What's going to happen over time is you're just going to learn. Your eye is going to be sort of trained when you trip over it a few times. When you see that ter and that tot in the middle of an adjective, you're going to learn the adjective as a vocabulary word. Then you're going to see this ter and tot, and you're going to know to translate it with the er or the est. This is the er is the comparative, comparing 2 ideas, and the tot is the superlative, comparing one and saying it's greater than all in that category. That is the newest car that of all the cars, something like that, or that is the best car amongst all the cars, something like that. Okay, so it's superlative overall. That's one way to do it. As he says in number 1 on English formation on page 154, sometimes in English we can use auxiliary words like high, more high, most high. Or sometimes we do irregular formations using alternative words, good, better, or best. And if you were to try think about it in English, if you try to teach somebody in English good, better, or best, those are just 3 different words they'd have to learn by vocabulary. And they wouldn't know that those ideas are irregular ways to say positive, comparative, superlative. If we say something is good, that's positive. If we say something is best, if something is better, that's comparative. That's better than that. this is better than that. I'm comparing two items, saying one is a little bit comparative better than the other. But I can do the superlative with a completely different word, saying it's the best. And in which case it's a superlative idea. 3 different words. It's an irregular way to do it. And Greek has some of the same thing. So as you see there in number 2 on 154, you have this way to do it, the ter tot. And then sometimes you can have irregular forms as well, like good, better, and best. So there are 2 ways. This is one way. And the other way, as you see there in number 2, Greek formation, on page 154, is to use irregular ways. And some common irregular ways, he's saying, and you just learn these as vocabulary words. There's really no other way to do it. Pleon, which is more or greater, something like that. Apollos is another one. Meson. Meson is another one. This is greater or larger. Megas is another one. And then another better is, he's just giving you vocabulary there. And he's saying basically you just got to learn these. These are common ones. You just learn as vocabulary. Creton. And a lot of these, if not all of them, are going to be in your vocabulary list on page, am I still on video? Yeah. On page 172. If you look at 172, maison is there in the first column, 3/4 of the way down. So he's going to give you, and so is a creton. That one's on that list too, and he's giving you a number of those irregular comparative adjectives. Those are irregular, like good, better, or best. So you can do it regular by changing the spelling, putting these little suffixes in between the stem and the ending in an adjective, or you could do it irregular with just some key adjective words here. Now, he also says sometimes you can have these functioning in a substantival use, and he gives you an example there, the least. So again, least is a comparative adjective, but if you have it with an article, that's the key. And this is driven by context. So there's 2 ideas here that you need to know if a comparative is being used as a substantive, like a noun, like a subject of a sentence. The least are going to win the day. Okay. Notice in that sentence, least is actually comparative. That's the least valuable car on the lot. In that sense, it's truly just a comparative. But if I say the least will win the day, okay, the least in that sentence is a substantive, and it's signaled by two things. Number 1, it has an article, and number 2, context. So if you see a substantive or see a comparative vocabulary word that you've learned, and it has an article, and in the sentence, it's not, it doesn't make sense. Ask the question: is it somewhat driven by context? Is it functioning as a substantive? Is it a subject of a verb? Is it the object of a verb? Something like that. That's what he means in the bottom of page 154. Now, another way, one of the things he says on 155, you need to learn. This is just a hey, heads up kind of thing. In Koine Greek, over time, this is one of the differences between classical Greek and Koine Greek. Koine is sort of street Greek, remember, and it starts to oversimplifies. This is what street language always does. Colloquial language oversimplifies things a lot of times and muddies the water on stuff. And this is one example. He's going to say, hey, just be aware that when you're translating the New Testament, oftentimes adjectives that are in comparative form, he's going to say that Koine is changing the rules for comparative degrees. Adjectives in comparative form were used with superlative meaning. So sometimes the form you're going to see this kind of a comparative, and really they mean superlative. And you go, well, how am I supposed to know that? That's just context. You learn that over time, and you know that in classical Greek, they differentiated between these two. And if they meant this one, they meant newer. If they wrote this one, they meant newest. In Koine, it got a bit lazy, and it blurred the lines. And sometimes they wrote this for newer, and sometimes they wrote this for newest. And they just dropped this one out. Okay, and context is the only determination. And so he gives you some examples on page 154 of how Koine began to do that. Now, last thing on comparatives is adverb comparisons. Well, and then construction comparisons. Well, 2 more things. Now, Greek verbs, he says, have degrees as well. Now, unlike adjectives, Greek adverbs, so I say Greek verbs, Greek adverbs are not inflected because adverbs are not inflected, even though the adjectives are. So you can do comparison ideas with adverbs, but it's mostly driven, again, by vocabulary. You're not going to have these. See, what's going to happen is, depending on what this is doing in the sentence, because this is an adjective comparative, you could get ending changes. You're still going to have the tear and the tot in these regular forms, but you could get ending changes. Adverb comparisons don't work that way because adverbs aren't inflected. So you get adverbs is another way to do comparisons. Here's what don't lose the big picture here. What Stevens is doing is saying, hey, there are a number of ways to do comparisons in a language. In the true is in English. Regular, irregular. Another way now is adverb comparisons. And that's what he's introducing you to on the very bottom of page 155. And so you have some adverbs that are comparative adverbs. You have some adverbs that are superlative adverbs, like malesta. You see that at the very bottom line of page 155. Malesta, most, translated most. And you go, well, that's a comparative adverb. How do I know that? Like all adverbs, you just learn them as vocabulary. So it's more vocabulary work. So all he's saying is hey, just be aware and learn these as vocabulary. This is another way to do comparison by using an adverb to do it. So you could do the irregular on before, or now you find out you can do some adverb comparisons, and it's just vocabulary words. Okay, finish this video out, page 156 and 157. There is another way to do comparisons, and it's not with the adjectives, regular and irregular. It's not with the adverb. Okay, it does comparisons by way of grammatical construction, and this is what he's talking about on page 156 and 157. So you've learned so far 3 or 4 different ways to do comparisons. Here's another way: grammatical construction. Now, with grammatical construction, he gives you 3 major ways, and you see them numbered there on page 156. Number 1 is the ablative of comparison. Number 2 is the accusative of comparison, and then number 3 is by way of using the conjunction a. Okay, so what's the ablative of comparison? The ablative is when you put a substantive after a comparative adjective, but the substantive is in the genitive case. That's the key. So I have a comparative adjective. Look at his example here. I have a comparative adjective, maison, and you go, oh, I learned that as a vocabulary word. That's a comparative adjective. Okay, I just flipped my page. So when I have a comparative adjective, and then following the comparative adjective, so you can kind of see this. Let me do it in a different color. So following the comparative adjective, I get this genitive, this substantive, this noun construction, and I'm going to go to the second line because I've run out of space here. And I'm just giving you an example right off the middle of page 156. So I've got this comparative adjective here, and then it is followed by a noun, a substantive, a noun construction, but it's in the genitive case. Now, if I tried to translate that very literally or woodenly, you would go, okay, I learned this word as greater of his Lord. Greater of his Lord, that doesn't make any sense. So what you need to know here is that this is one of those kind of grammatical constructions. It's not quite an idiom, though you might describe it as an idiom. I guess you could describe it as an idiom, but it's a grammatical construction, a way to formulate words to communicate comparison. In which case, when I have this kind of construction, a genitive following this genitive case, and it's going to be, so it's functioning as an ablative. So whenever I have this genitive substantive following the comparative adjective, I translate it greater than. I have to go, where do you get the word than? It's in the construction. There's no word for than. It's not greater of his Lord. It's greater than his master or Lord. The second one you see there in number 2, accusative of comparison, and this is when you use the preposition either para or huper with the substantive, and that substantive is in the accusative case, sharper. Notice you have the adjective. Erase this real quick. Notice you have the adjective there. Markers run out. There's the tear. You see that? See that tear right there? So I have this adjective, and then it's using the huper, or he says you can also have the para. So the huper or the para followed by an accusative. I'm not going to write it out, but the rest of that is the accusative there in number 2 on page 156. When you have that accusative case, a substantive in the accusative case followed para or huper with that comparative adjective, you translate it than. You're getting a comparative idea, than. The last way to do it is probably the simplest way to spot, is with this conjunction a. When you have a conjunction a, you're sometimes going to want to, you can translate it, it usually means or, but when it's when used in comparison can mean than. And that's a bit of context. So he's giving you an example there on the bottom of page 157, and then on top of 156 and 157. And again, with this third option, A, you go, well, how do I recognize that? Just learn this as a vocabulary, or than. It can be translated than, this or that, or this is in the example he gives you, heaven and earth will pass away is easier than one small stroke of a letter. Sometimes you'll want to translate it or. On context is the determination on this. Just know that this is a third option grammatical construction for making comparisons. So he introduces you to 3 of them. So comparisons can be made via through adjectives, and there are regular and irregular forms of doing that, with the ter tot as newer, newest. You can have irregular ways of just vocabulary, adjective vocabulary. Another way you learn doing comparatives is with comparative adverbs. They're non-inflected. You learn them as vocabulary. And then now you learn on page 156, 157, another way to do construction is at least 3 grammatical constructions, or another way to do comparisons is 3 grammatical constructions. All right, that's comparisons in the Greek language. In the next part I'll do another video, a part 2 video, and we'll cover the subject of numbers.